All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we're continuing our breakdowns of each position group, talking about the Falcons D line group as we head into training camp. And we'll focus a lot on whether or not Eddie Goldman is finally the sort of running mate that we need next to Grady Jarrett. And we'll talk about whether or not Marlon Davidson or Vincent Taylor or Taquan Graham can sort of step up and be sort of the third guy in the room.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, as well on YouTube. And if you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, you give us a like, hit that bell. You'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So as we continue these sort of positional breakdowns, we ask one big question for the Falcons season, one big question to pay attention to for this summer, and then whatever other topics, other roster battles and whatnot. So that big question of the season really boils down to, is Eddie Goldman just kind of a stopgap, or is he sort of the long-term potential option to play next to Grady Jarrett? We know that Grady Jarrett is solid, got the 1-year contract extension, which signs him through Atlanta, or it's a multi-year contract extension, but it essentially boils down to, at least we know he'll get one more year in Atlanta beyond 2022. So he's definitely going to be here in Atlanta through 2023. Whether he's here in 2024 and 2025, those last 2 years of the contract extension are sort of dependent on factors outside of his control, particularly team success or whatever the case may be. But we're hoping that we see Grady Jarrett, another 4 years of Grady Jarrett here in Atlanta. And we're hoping that, unlike the last couple of years, that Grady Jarrett has a lot more help. Not only from the edge rushers, but also a running mate. It's not necessarily that Eddie Goldman's going to now, his presence is going to now prevent Grady Jarrett from getting double teamed constantly. It's more that, okay, Grady Jarrett's going to get double teamed constantly, and now you just need more guys that can win their one-on-ones. And Eddie Goldman certainly is a guy that in the past has been able to win his one-on-ones. We talked about this on Friday's episode, talking about the Eddie Goldman sign and the potential impact that the thing, prior to sitting out the 2020 season due to COVID, but prior to that, for 3 or more years, Eddie Goldman was one of the premier 3-down nose tackles, meaning that not only does he provide value as a run defender at that nose tackle position as sort of a space eater, but also can provide some juice as a pass rusher. Then obviously coming back from the COVID year in 2021 with the Chicago Bears, Eddie Goldman had a down season and the Bears decided to move on given what they were paying him. But the expectation here in Atlanta is that even if Eddie Goldman is only as good as he was a year ago with Chicago, which wasn't great, that's still an upgrade over what the Falcons had along their D-line last year, particularly when you look at the production of like Tyler Davidson and Mike Pennell and Jonathan Ballard, the sort of 3 veteran guys on the D-line that the Falcons were constantly rotating along with some of their young guys. That, like, if Eddie Goldman is still only like a 20 pressure guy, that's still twice as productive as those 3 guys were combined last year. And in reality, he'll probably be, hopefully, we'll see, he'll be closer to being maybe a 30 pressure guy this season for the Falcons. And given that Eddie Goldman is only 28 years old, about 9 months younger than Grady Jarrett, he signed a 1-year prove it deal. But if he does wind up proving it and start, particularly if he lives up to his pre-COVID performances, that's a guy that the Falcons could re-up with long term. and give him a long-term contract, and so that we could see an Eddie Goldman, Grady Jarrett combination here in Atlanta for many years to come, not just this fall. And so we know that with this team, we've termed it before with the we call it, at least I call it, the Fabian Moreau strategy, where you sign these guys to these 1 year prove it deals, and it's like, come to Atlanta, play well for us for the 1 year, and somebody will pay you. Right. And prior to this upcoming offseason, next offseason after this upcoming season, that somebody more often than not has been other teams, because the Falcons have, been frugal and or limited in terms of what they can spend. And next offseason will be the first time for this new regime where they will have less limits, let's say, on their spending. We won't be able, we shouldn't have many conversations about the cap, let's say 6 months from now, over the following 6 months. So, there is a golden opportunity for Goldman to earn that prove it deal and to prove it here in Atlanta and get that money here in Atlanta. So we'll see if he can do that. And that's going to be important long term, because we've talked about this before when we talked about Troy Anderson, the Falcons' second round linebacker, is that if you want to maximize Troy Anderson's developmental potential, given how much he struggled at Montana State dealing with blockers, you imagine it's not going to be easier getting to the NFL level for him to deal with, offensive linemen. So you want to have that space eating nose tackle that can keep him clean, in addition to, be the guy that lines up next to Grady Jarrett, that can, take on some of those double teams, but also take advantage of the one-on-ones that player is going to get. So we'll see if Eddie Goldman can live up to those expectations. I have, relatively high hopes. If you've been listening to this podcast for the last, 2 months, you've been hearing me talk quite a bit about adding a player like Eddie Goldman. So, the last thing I would like to have happen again is for me to spend, weeks talking about, hey, we should sign Marvin Hall, right? And then they sign Marvin Hall, and then they do nothing. We get like what one reception for 10 yards. So I don't want to make this a common theme. I know that the regime listens to Locked On Falcons, as you guys do. It's their first listen each and every day, on the same podcast platforms that you guys are checking out this show. And I would like to believe that, as they take my advice, are like, yes, Aaron is, the smartest man in the world. We have to follow his personnel advice. And so I'm hoping that, we don't whiff on this one with this Eddie Goldman thing. So we'll see how that goes, guys. And that's sort of the big question to pay attention to this season. But there are some things to pay attention this summer as we get into training camp. And we'll talk about sort of, we know Grady Jarrett and Eddie Goldman are going to be the two main guys on the interior, but who's going to be a third guy, particularly in the Falcons base defense? And that will be sort of up for grabs throughout training camp this summer. And we'll get into that on who could be the front runners for that. Is it Taquan Graham? Is it Vincent Taylor? Is it Marlon Davidson? Or is Marlon Davidson on the bubble? We'll talk about all that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I want to tell you about BetOnline, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. Whether you're looking for the latest odds, contests, or player props, BetOnline has it all. Whether you want to bet on golf, to Tour de France, Major League Baseball, boxing, UFC, esports, Vegas casino games, you want to bet on future bets for the NBA next year, the NHL, of course, the NFL next year. We're talking about whether or not Eddie Goldman will bounce back. He's not necessarily a high candidate for comeback player of the year, but one player that is got decent odds for that. That's Marcus Mariota. So you can bet on him, 14-1 odds to win comeback player of the year at BetOnline. So head on over to the website at betonline.net to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we talked about the big question of the season surrounding Eddie Goldman and what he can do for this Falcons defensive line. The big question of the summer is going to be whether or not, Taquan Graham, Marlon Davidson, Anthony Rush, or Vincent Taylor sort of emerge as the third guy in the base defense. And sort of that guy can be a fixture as a starter for not only this year, but in the long term. Right. We know teams play nickel 70% of the time. And, primarily it will be Goldman and Jarrett, probably in all likelihood, rushing on those sort of third down situations. You'll also see a heavy dose of those guys on early downs and whatnot. But in the base defense, which you play about 30% of the time, there's the third D lineman in this Falcons sort of hybrid 3-4 fronts that they like to utilize. And who's going to be that guy? Who's going to be the third wheel, so to speak, among this D line? And if you base it off of who was getting the majority of snaps last year. Taquan Graham, I guess, technically is the incumbent starter, but he'll get pushed by guys like Marlon Davidson. He'll get pushed by Vincent Taylor. And I think Vincent Taylor is probably the most interesting of this group of players, beyond Eddie Goldman and Grady Jarrett, because when you look at his career body of work in the NFL over like 5 years of playing football, it, kind of blows the doors off of what Graham and Davidson have done in their very limited NFL careers. But the thing about Vincent Taylor is he's never been a true starter in this league. Like the closest he got was in 2018 when he was still with the Dolphins, and he was basically their third D tackle. He was their top backup D tackle that year. He did win the starting job with the Houston Texans this past year, but then got hurt in the week 1 game. And so, that's going to be a big issue for Vincent Taylor moving forward, whether or not he can avoid the injury bug, because part of the thing that happened at 2018 season is he got hurt midway through that season as well. So anytime he starts to build some momentum, he gets injured. That's been sort of the same story with Marlon Davidson as well. I think he's been on the COVID list 3 times in 2 years, and dealt with other injuries, particularly as a rookie, like with knee and hams and ankle issues or whatever it was that year as well. And so he's the same way, where anytime it seems like he's starting to build some momentum, something, whether it's COVID or an injury, has come along and derailed it. And so this is going to be a critical summer for Marlon Davidson, along with some of these other 2020 draft selections, not named AJ Terrell, but Marlon Davidson, Jalen Hawkins, Michael Walker, Matt Hennessy. For all 4 of those guys, this 2022 season is going to kind of be a make or break year for them, because in all 4 of their cases, this current regime has kind of drafted players that you could at least, say is a possible replacement for these guys. Taquan Graham with Marlon Davidson, Drew Dolman with Matt Hennessy, Troy Anderson with Michael Walker, and Richie Grant to a certain extent with Jalen Hawkins. And so this upcoming season, if these guys don't necessarily show that they can be fixtures here in Atlanta, you're looking at the potential of these guys being one contract players. You're looking at the potential of the team, now that they won't have as many spending limits, bringing in better options. So this is kind of a make break year for all of those guys. And especially, given how high a draft pick Marlon Davidson was a year ago, especially for him. So we'll see if him and Vincent Taylor can stay healthy. And if they can this summer, that will give them the best foot forward. But Davidson, certainly because of the aforementioned reasons, is not necessarily a lock to make the roster this year. I would still think he's a pretty safe bet at this point in time, just because the rest of the D-line group isn't necessarily stocked with, more proven options. And so if you're looking for another young guy with potential, it's hard to, it's not easy to him. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like, how many better options are there than Marlon Davidson, I guess is what I'm trying to sit here and say. But we'll see with him and Taquan Graham. Obviously, this current regime has a more vested interest in Taquan Graham succeeding than they necessarily do in Marlon Davidson, simply because Graham was their draft selection as opposed to Davidson being the previous regime's draft selection. But for me, at least, watching the film last year, I thought Graham and Davidson were pretty interchangeable when they were on the field last year. So we'll see if Taquan Graham can make a significant year 2 leap. That's one of the things I'm eager to see about this 2021 draft class, that, basically outside of Kyle Pitts, who we knew was good, how big a leaps are some of these other guys going to make? And whether or not a Taquan Graham, who was a guy that I looked at as like a back end rotational guy in a D-line rotation, a 7th or 8th man in an 8-man rotation, is sort of his potential in the NFL. Can he be more than that? Can he show a bigger leap than that and become a legit starter? Can he be a legit 3rd or 4th guy in a D-line rotation? And so that will be something to keep an eye on this summer, along with Davidson and Taylor and what they can do. And then you have Anthony Rush, who I think now with the Eddie Goldman assignment is kind of perfect for where he's at on the depth chart. He's ideally suited to be a backup, a depth piece, nose tackle that can keep a guy like Eddie Goldman fresh, but it wasn't necessarily destined to be a starter. Like we saw some flashes from Anthony Rush, particularly in that first Saints game last year, that we're like, oh, this is intriguing. But like after that, we didn't really see much from Anthony Rush to make you believe that he was a starter. So that was part of the reason why, like this, these last 2 months, I've been like, yeah, the Falcons definitely need to sign someone like an Eddie Goldman or a Brandon Williams, one of these sort of bigger nose tackles that can bring you a little bit of juice as a pass rusher because you weren't really expecting that from Anthony Rush. But I think, these four guys do sort of give the Falcons some decent, solid depth, and we'll just sort of see if any of these guys sort of emerge as a starter by summer's end. And if not, then maybe the Falcons go out there and go out there and get another guy, veteran at the end of training camp, like they just pulled off with the Eddie Goldman signing. Or could it be possible that one of these young guys, like a Jalen Dalton or one of these undrafted free agents, sort of emerge in the power of competition this summer? And we'll talk about that to wrap up today's D-line breakdown. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, or Spotify, or YouTube, you can find 3 different shows breaking down all of the big local sports headlines here in Atlanta and Georgia, as well as the national sports headline. You can check out A to Z with Mark Zinno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. Find them all on the same podcast feed. And if you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll also be able to check out the Locked On Braves postcast, breaking down every Atlanta Braves win and loss this season. And guys, I want to tell you also that today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer when you already have access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket? Save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts from a car dealership or chain store. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years with reliably low prices for every single customer. They have everything you need, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Just go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So we're talking about the rest of the D-line room, and we know, or we suspect, that the Falcons will probably keep 6 D linemen, and that was one of the big reasons why I was very confident the Falcons would sign a veteran D lineman, because you looked at, like, they had 5 guys that you would say, like, oh, those are 5 guys that will make the team, but they're going to keep 6 on the roster. So where's that 6th guy going to come from? And that's why for months I've been predicting a signing like Eddie Goldman. But you look at the 6 guys now, with Eddie Goldman being that 6th guy, joining Jarrett, Graham, Davidson, Taylor, and Rush as the guys most likely to make the roster. And so it's very likely that the remainder of the D linemen of the Falcons are bringing to camp this summer are really competing for a practice squad spot, but you never know. As I said, Marlon Davidson's not a lock. Vincent Taylor's not a lock. Anthony Rush is not a lock. And so there is a possibility the door is still cracked for one of these guys to emerge and potentially up in the depth chart with a strong summer. I think Jalen Dalton's probably the most intriguing of this group, being that he's at least checks the boxes on paper when you look at what he brings to the table from an athletic, a size, a length standpoint, being 6'6" with an 83-inch wingspan. There's another player that's on the Falcons roster that's 6'6" with an 83-inch wingspan, and he's considered a unicorn, and his name is Kyle Pitts. And so, Jalen Dalton's 300 pounds, so he's like a 300-pound Kyle Pitts. So, I don't know if he's a unicorn, but maybe he's a donkey with a, I don't know, maybe this is too, this sounds like slander to Jalen Dalton. I don't mean it as slander, but maybe he's not maybe he's not a unicorn, but maybe he's a donkey with a plastic horn, a stick taped to his head or something like that. I don't know, but maybe he is a unicorn. So we'll see if he can sort of emerge at that. I've read some articles where he was very close to making the Saints roster the last couple of summers. Unfortunately for him, similar to kind of what we've been talking about with Vincent Taylor and Marlon Davidson, injuries have seemingly derailed him in those attempts to make the roster. And again, maybe this is the summer where he gets the lucky break and can find a path to making the 53-man roster here in Atlanta. So I think of this group, if you were to bet on anybody, that's probably at least the more intriguing option. Because maybe he is, again, sorry, Jalen Dalton, for calling you a donkey, donkey with a stick on your forehead. But maybe he is a legit unicorn, and so maybe he can surprise. Nick Thurman's the other sort of quote unquote veteran of the group, although Nick Thurman doesn't have a ton of experience playing in games. He did get some action in that Buffalo game late for the Falcons after spending the year on the practice squad. He had a couple of years on the Patriots practice squad prior to the Falcons scooping him up. I thought Nick Thurman was decent for like the 17 snaps he played in that Bills game. So he's a guy that this is kind of potentially his last shot. Like he's going to be 27. Dalton's like 24. But like, Thurman's not going to get too many opportunities at this point because you're not going to see too many teams eager to sign a 28 or 29-year-old D tackle that has, I don't know, 30 career snaps or whatever the case may be moving forward. So this is kind of his last summer. So we'll see if that sort of motivates him and lights a fire under his butt to potentially push for one of these, roster spots or practice squad spot for a second year in a row. And we'll see what the undrafted rookies can do. I would sit here today, especially now with the Goldman signing, feeling like they're unlikely to stick on the 53-man roster. There was a chance until the Falcons signed Goldman because there was, that sixth spot up for grabs that maybe one of these guys could impress to make the roster. Again, still a possibility there. And we'll see if any of these guys can emerge. I think of the three undrafted free agents, the two that are probably the most intriguing for similar reasons as Jalen Dalton, just because on paper, given their size and speed and athleticism, is probably Timmy Horn, the nose tackle from Kansas State, who I believe was a transfer from Charlotte, and Derek Tangelo, who's at Penn State alongside Arnold Ebiketie and was a transfer from somewhere. All I can think of is Temple because that was Arnold Ebiketie where he came from, but I can't remember where Tangelo came from. But those are two guys that are at least more intriguing to me based off of what little I've seen of these undrafted free agents. Watched a couple of clips, a couple of highlights, or whatever the case may be. But what didn't do too deep a dive on these guys, but they're intriguing to me. So, whether it's the practice squad for some of these guys or potentially making a really strong push to be a seventh D lineman or to steal a sixth spot from, maybe one of the quote unquote bubble guys like Marlon Davidson or Anthony Rush or Vincent Taylor, we'll just sort of have to see. And as I said earlier, we could also see the Falcons, come out of the summer feeling not too particularly pleased by everybody not named Grady Jarrett, everybody not named Eddie Goldman this summer, and still being proactive at the end of the summer to bring in a potential veteran along the D line as well, when we get to the end of August or early September or whatever case may be. So it's something to keep an eye on moving forward, that the Falcons may not be done shuffling their depth and their rotation along this defensive line. As we have been saying for the last couple of years, is Grady Jarrett needs all the help he can get. So no one's certainly going to complain about the Falcons adding more talent along their interior defensive line. So that's it, guys, talking about the interior defensive line. Tomorrow we'll be talking all about the edge group, and we'll talk a little bit about what those guys may be bringing from a production standpoint and what their projections may be, and the possibility that we may see double the amount of sacks from this defense and this edge rusher group than we saw a year ago with those guys. And so we'll go deeper into some of my projections and what we can see from those guys on tomorrow's episode. But if you want to provide your feedback on anything I've discussed on today's episode, anything I've discussed on previous episodes, or anything I've discussed on past episodes or future, you want me to discuss on future episodes, you can, of course, hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. We'll be getting these, positional breakdowns for the rest of this week. And then, we're only a couple of weeks away from training camp. So, we'll be breaking down the defense and whatnot as we move forward here. Now the D-line is done. And we'll just sort of see if Eddie Goldman can be all the things that we dream him to be, or at least I dream him to be. There haven't been too many things that I've been given a thumbs up for the Falcons this offseason. So Eddie Goldman's one of the few things. So it would be, just my luck that it doesn't go as well as I hope it goes. But we're being a lot more positive on this podcast, and I feel reasonably confident and optimistic that Eddie Goldman will be everything that we dream him to be. And we'll see if, the Falcons add a little bit more to that. But that's going to do it for us, guys, here. If you want to check out other shows as your second listen, always recommend checking out any of the Locked On Sports Atlanta shows, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs. You can, of course, always check out Locked On NFL to get the lowdown on the latest going on with the other 31 teams around the NFL. You can check out Locked On Bets. And, of course, head on over to Bet Online or to Rock Auto to find all the parts you need as the Falcons shop for parts, along their defense all summer long. So, guys, that is going to do it for us here. Appreciate it. Till then.